All right, well, I'm excited to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Katie Cruz. Dr. Cruz is a graduate of Loma Linda University. She's a clinical psychologist, and she is the clinical director of Beautiful Minds Medical in Auburn, California. And she's here with her husband, Pastor Aaron Cruz. So, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So we are doing a 3-part series. Today we'll do part 1 and 2, and then tomorrow part 3. And they all really complement each other. So this is a plug for you to come to all 3. And the first one is entitled Conceal and Seal, the Invisible Wounds of Trauma. Many times when people ask me to come and speak, they'll say, can you speak about depression? Can you speak about anxiety? And I used to. But then the longer I've been in this field, I started to realize really the trauma is the root behind depression and anxiety. And many times mental health and the field of mental health are really focusing on the symptoms, but we're not focusing on the root. And so trauma is often the root. And so I like to now speak about trauma not just because it's the root, but because we don't talk about trauma. So one, if it's the root and we're not talking about it, right, that's a problem. And we'll especially highlight in part 1 the invisible wounds, right? We might be talking about things we see, but when it's something we don't see but it's affecting us to the core, it's important to talk about. And this whole first presentation is we're talking about the importance of trauma. And so why do we not talk about trauma? The first point is that there's this delusion that it's the minority. Only some people deal with trauma. And so let's first take a look at the statistics and whether or not this really is the minority. Here's a quote by a trauma expert, Peter Levine. Trauma is perhaps the most avoided, ignored, belittled, denied, misunderstood, and untreated cause of human suffering. If we first look at childhood, these are really sobering statistics. More than 2/3 of children reported at least one traumatic event by age 16. 2 out of 3 children. And always keep in mind, whenever we talk about statistics, these are the ones that are reported. So you always wonder, is it more than what we hear? A report of child abuse is made every 10 seconds. And we do know that in the field of mental health, not everyone's reporting child abuse. Every 9 minutes, a child is sexually assaulted. 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 6 boys sexually abused before 18. 4 in 10 children in the US say they experienced a physical assault during the past year. So notice so far, we have different kinds of abuse, but all very prevalent. And then notice not just that there is abuse, but the severity of it. In 2023, about 2,000 children died of abuse and neglect in the US. That's 5 to 6 every single day. I don't know how many of you had watched the Netflix mini kind of docu-series on Gabriel Fernandez. Anyone here? Okay, one person. It was a series that talked about, it was a very monumental event that for the first time social workers were actually being prosecuted for the death of this child because they didn't take the proper steps to protect. The child, it was well known that the child was being abused. Teachers reported it, others reported it, but the social workers didn't do their due diligence and the child died. And so we see that it's not just that it's happening, but it's also quite severe. Now, you take that and you say, wow, a lot of children, but also trauma continues to happen in adulthood. About 6 of 10 men and 5 of 10 women experience at least one trauma in their lives. Women generally tend to experience more sexual assault and men more physical assault, but both can experience different kinds of abuse. Every 68 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted. 1 of 6 women are forcibly raped, 1 in 33 for men. 20 people in the US per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner. And we saw these numbers skyrocket during COVID, right? These individuals being stuck in their homes in violent relationships. 1 in 13 people will develop PTSD at some point in their life. And typically, when people thought about trauma, they think about veterans. You'd be like, okay, yeah, that population has experienced trauma. But what we start to realize by these statistics, it's all across the board. Childhood, adulthood, men, women, different people. And we realize that, again, it's a delusion that it's the minority, right? If we just took a moment and we had an open floor for people to share, we would be quite shocked and amazed how many people have experienced trauma. Another reason why we think it's the minority is we often use an incorrect definition for trauma. Right? We have a certain view of it, but what exactly is trauma? So here is the American Psychological Association's definition. Don't register this because this is actually not the best definition, but this comes from the Psychological Association. An emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, rape, or natural disaster. What do you think is problematic with this definition? Anyone? So say it out loud. It's more, yeah. Now, it gave it just some examples, but what about the definition, an emotional response to a terrible event? It's not just emotional, yes. What else? Yes. So I kind of cued you in with the things that are highlighted. Not just emotional, and not just a stereotypical terrible event, singular event. So we're going to look at what's problematic. So typical definitions on the left here, notice, focus on acute one-time events. This is the classic veteran experience. They go, they experience combat, it's an event, and they say, okay, that's what trauma is. But a lot of times people experience trauma as an event or a series of events. This is why childhood trauma is often neglected when it's happening throughout their childhood. It's not this one-time event that we would say is catastrophic, right? Like 9/11, which we were talking about earlier, like, oh, that's traumatic. What about the ongoing events? Number 2, it suggests it must be a life-threatening, right, terrible event. But it's not just life-threatening. This is where we talk about there's 2 kind of categories of trauma, type A and type B. Type B is what we think about when it comes to trauma, the bad things happening. But type A is the absence of good. So think about it when it comes to children. If you don't feed a child physically, what happens to their development, physical development? It's slowed and stunted. Well, what happens if you don't feed a child emotional nourishment? They are also stunted. So trauma is not just, and this is a very important point for us to kind of change our definition of trauma, it's not just bad things happening. It's also the absence of good. So a lot of times when we talk about childhood trauma, we talk about sexual abuse. That's a bad thing happening, which is true. But what about neglect? It's the absence of love, the absence of attention. And what we know of what children need, attachment and love and nourishment, I often think about my clients as being emotionally malnourished. Because we need these things. It's actually to the core of what we need as much as food, in a way that type A trauma is also trauma. Number 3, it often focuses on typical acknowledged events, right? Rape, natural disaster, combat, etc. But what about atypical events? We don't think about bullying, and these days cyberbullying, which is really been spotlighted recently in a way that some kids are committing suicide based off of cyberbullying. What about a detached mother? I've had clients where they share their younger years and they tell me, oh yeah, my mom was really depressed. And what impact does that have on a child? A baby's crying and crying and crying. That is traumatic for a baby. And their mother may love them later on, but maybe the mother's just depressed and unable to be there. So there are many good-intentioned parents with children that could have still experienced trauma. Another common one are medical procedures. I've had many clients who have had traumatic medical procedures. During COVID, I had a colleague who actually recorded a podcast, shared her testimony of a very traumatic birth experience during COVID, in which led to postpartum depression and other experiences that was very traumatic. We often we use the language of small t trauma versus big T. Big T is the ones that we think about typically, right? Big T traumas. But even the small ones that we don't think are significant, but that they continue and they wear and tear on the human psyche. Number 4, events. We typically, when it comes to trauma, focus on events that happen in adulthood. But trauma often starts in childhood and either gets shaped or also happens in adulthood. So hopefully this starts to expand your mind of the understanding of trauma. And I use this too because many times people have come to me and they're like, oh, my childhood was good. And I'm like, I don't know you yet, but my guess is probably not based off of the symptoms you're showing. Well, my parents, they were fine. They were, good working citizens, blah, blah, blah. And then they say something like, I never heard I love you growing up. And so we have to understand that trauma includes a lot more experiences and a self-reflection of what were my experiences like? Did I experience any trauma? Gabor Mate, another well-known trauma expert, he says this in his book, The Myth of Normal. The usual conception of trauma conjures up notions of catastrophic events, hurricanes, abuse, egregious neglect, and war. This has the unintended, and misleading effect of relegating trauma to the realm of the abnormal, the unusual, the exceptional. If there exists a class of people we call traumatized, that must mean that most of us are not. Here we miss the mark by a wide margin. In fact, someone without the marks of trauma would be an outlier in our society. So he's flipping it. It's actually not the minority. We are closer to the truth when we ask, where do we each fit on the broad and surprisingly inclusive trauma spectrum? Which of its many marks has each of us carried all or most of our lives? And what have been the impacts? And what possibilities would open up were we to become more familiar and even intimate with them? And then he ends, it may also be disconcerting for many of us to consider that as happy and well-adjusted as we think ourselves to be, we may fall somewhere on the trauma spectrum, even if it's far from the big T pole. This is also a little bit of what my husband preached of earlier, of the collective trauma of how sin has entered into the world. We all have been impacted. And instead of looking at other people, some of you may have come here to say, oh, I want to help so-and-so, but it's also good to reflect on how have I been wounded. Now, what exactly is trauma? Trauma comes from the Greek word meaning wound, right? Very simple, wound. But what exactly is this wound? This is the most simple, not common definition for trauma, but think about it in this way. Trauma is the rupturing of relationships with others, with self, and with God. So take a look at some common traumas and use this definition, see if it fits. Rape. What's the rupturing of relationships that happens with rape? Typically with others, right? This is where sometimes people, they might say, all men are untrustworthy. Not only did they have a disruption with that person, that perpetrator, but also maybe with their connection with the opposite sex. One that we often don't think of is rape is also a rupturing of relationship with yourself, where people start to feel my body is broken, I'm damaged, I'm dirty. There's a disruption even with a relationship with themselves. And then with God, how many people as a result of trauma, not just rape, but many others, start to blame God? There's a rupturing there as well. What about neglect, right? Neglect is a common rupturing of a relationship with the person who was meant to care for you, whether parents or caregivers, a spouse. You can take each of these and you can realize at the core of what makes it traumatic is the rupturing of relationships. Why? Because at the core of who we are relational beings. Which later, not today, tomorrow, we'll talk about then a big part of healing is reconnection. But trauma is the rupturing of relationships. Peter Levine puts it this way: it's a loss of connection to ourselves, our families, and the world around us. Now, what trauma is not? Certainly all traumatic events are stressful, but not all stressful events are traumatic. It often has these two components. This is where some people are saying like, oh, now people are just using the word trauma all the time now, right? We've gone from like stigma to then people over-normalizing it. But trauma requires a diminishing effect. Did it have a negative impact on you? Some people, could have gone through a catastrophic natural disaster and it wasn't traumatic for them, right? A diminishing effect and a persistent effect, right? And this is why there's different disorders, right? The PTSD being the most common, but depression, anxiety, and others where trauma gets manifested in these ways. Second point of why we don't talk about trauma is that we don't really understand the severity of it. So this was mentioned earlier when we talked about the incorrect definition. It's not just a psychological, emotional experience. Look at this long word there, biopsychosocial, spiritual, is we now understand trauma to have an effect on every single aspect of health. So we're going to go through each of these. Now, the most obvious is the psychological impact. Here are some statistics. People who have experienced trauma are 3 times more likely to experience depression, 4 times more likely to have ADHD. Now, let me just pause on that one because, and this applies to different ones I'm going to mention, but a lot of times we think ADHD and other mental illnesses are just something biological, right? Like, oh, that my brain is different or broken. But there's a huge link between ADHD and trauma. And we see it, right? 4 times. That's another way to say that is you're 400% more likely to have ADHD when you've experienced trauma. And there's actually, research being done of like, is there actual gene for it? And they haven't found a gene for it. They found a stress gene, and that stress gene is often activated by trauma. 15 times more likely to attempt suicide. Many times people are like, oh, suicide's related to depression. What about trauma, underlying trauma? 4 times more likely to develop alcoholism. We'll talk about addiction next after this presentation. 2.5 times more likely to smoke. And then a host of a lot of different ones, not enough space or time to talk about it. But overall, trauma doubles the risk for developing mental illness, triples the risk of being diagnosed with a serious mental illness. Now, what about the biological impact? I think most people know about the psychological impact, but it's coming out more and more, but we forget that our mind and our bodies are linked. We separate them, right? Oh, I have depression. Oh, that's just in my mind. But what about the link between our minds and our bodies, including trauma and the impact it has on our biology? I'm going to first talk about the impact it has on children. So some of these things are more technical. For those who know more about the body, I include it up here. But for those who don't, I'm going to just summarize what's generally happening. There's a change, a significant change in hormones. They have elevated children, they measure this in children, have elevated and prolonged levels of cortisol and adrenaline. Who knows what cortisol and adrenaline are primarily related to? Stress. Now, cortisol often gets labeled as the stress hormone. It's actually energy. But think about like when I see a bear, danger, danger, my body kicks into fight or flight, which is wonderful because I need to, well, actually, you shouldn't run from a bear. But I either need to fight or flee. My body needs to be fully activated. But with children, notice it says elevated and prolonged. It's not just my system turns on and I prepare for the danger's gone and it relaxes. It's chronically on. It's like you turn on the light switch and it's just on. What would happen if you left the light switch on, not turning it off? It's going to burn. Children are having these elevated hormones, which, in other words, chronic activation of their stress response. We have two main systems in which we switch from relaxed to activation. Relaxed to activation. Hopefully all of you here are in the relaxed state. And it's a way we recharge, and then when we have danger, then we turn it on. But children often have constant danger in their home environments in a way that the body's like, you can't turn off. This is the idea of hypervigilance. I always have to be scanning my environment. A classic example of this is for veterans. They'll often say, I can't sit with my door to the back, right? I need to watch the door because anything could happen. Hypervigilance. Vigilance is really good when you're in an unsafe neighborhood, right? Or you're in a territory that there's danger. But think about children that are having to constantly do this, and it wears and tears on the body. And part of that, number two, is you see a weakened immune system, which makes sense, right? If a system is constantly on and it's wearing and tearing, so some of these fancy words here are talking about a really compromised immune system. This is where some kids, a potential sign of trauma, not guaranteed, might be that they're constantly getting sick because their immune system is overtaxed and then vulnerable. What's sad too is some of these things, including thymus involution and so forth, are signs of rapid aging. These kids are aging rapidly internally in a way that is very damaging. In general, I don't know if I have this on a slide, but people who have experienced trauma, and especially that then lead to serious chronic mental illness, can live 10 years shorter than those who have not experienced that. Also, we see brain changes. If you were to do a brain scan of a child who has experienced trauma, and this also applies to adults who don't heal from trauma, is that they have in their prefrontal cortex weakened areas, right? So it could even be shrinkage in the brain of that area, and strengthened pathways in the survival parts, which is the middle. So if this was your brain, it actually kind of looks like a brain. The knuckles would be your prefrontal cortex area, your frontal lobe. And then your thumb would be your survival areas, your limbic system, your motion centers. And so what we see is this center is weakened, very little pathways. And this center is very strong. Why? Because the survival parts of your brain have had to be used like a muscle over and over. So this one's strong. This is why the kids with trauma are very impulsive. And what's really sad is that we punish kids for misbehavior when they've experienced trauma, but it's not misbehavior. Their impulsivity was an adaptive strategy in a world of trauma. Their brain's like, oh, we need to be on guard. This part of the brain, let's get really strong. And this part is part of logical and slow thinking. When you're driving and you're about to get hit by a car, you want this center to be activated and this one not to be. Why? Do you want to be thinking, this car's about to hit me. Let me pause for a second and think about what I should do. No, what do you want to do? You want to instantly swerve. You want to be impulsive. And so children who are in these environments, they are their brain is rewired. God has an amazing design, even in the context of sin. It rewires in order to adapt to the environment it's in.
So what if you have a child who was born like that, hasn't had experiences to do that?
Yeah, so there's multiple things with that. Sometimes there's generational trauma. And so what's good news is there's neuroplasticity, which means you can rewire your brain. And a lot of times children might already be sensitive, and children in general, they already have a weakened frontal lobe. It doesn't develop till past 25. This is why they'd say, I don't know about the 18-year-old drinking limit, right? It's like, no, maybe 25 or so forth. But parents are the frontal lobes for their children. And so you need to teach them how to regulate. I was just having a client yesterday who was really upset at his teenage daughter for having this huge blowout. And he's like, that's ridiculous. I was just telling her to finish her food. And I said, you don't understand. She has really big emotions, and she's never learned. And what's sad is parents often don't know it for themselves, so they don't teach the children how to regulate their emotions. And then kids get in trouble for those emotions. So part of what I appreciate about these presentations is understanding the roots to some things that we see on the outside in a way that we punish, instead of saying, oh, wow, maybe this child that's misbehaving has a rewired brain in a way that we can teach them. You can rewire it. So whatever the cause is, you can rewire your brain and change these pathways. And you can strengthen the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobes are like the brakes to the gas pedal of your emotions. So you can strengthen your brakes. But a lot of these poor kids are driving a really fast car without brakes. But they've never been taught where the brakes are and how to use them. And then this is another thing that's really important, and I see God's design in, is there are epigenetic changes. So we have genes, and some people are like, oh, I'm doomed. My parents experienced trauma, what I just mentioned about generational trauma. Oh no, I'm doomed. But genes can be turned on and turned off by our experiences. This is why, later tomorrow I'll talk about diet, exercise, other things that through these experiences, and I'll share a testimony from my father, you can actually turn on or off certain genes. It's quite amazing. It's like you're not doomed. You have the ability to either increase the risk or decrease the risk of mental illness, addiction, or physical diseases. What we see in adults, it's a long list of different physical diseases that have been linked to trauma. So I'm going to highlight a few that I see the most. I used to work in primary care settings where they just wrote this huge grant in Loma Linda, and I was one of the first students at that time, and then later I graduated and was hired on to be a psychologist integrated into primary care settings. And the reason behind this was a lot of people won't go to therapy, but they'll go to their doctor and they say, oh, doctor, I've been having a lot of GI issues. A lot of problems with my abdomen, and can you fix my physical illness? And GI issues are highly tied to anxiety and trauma. Why? Because the fight or flight system I talked about that gets turned on, well, when you're trying to run away from a lion, our body with our fight or flight turns off our digestion system. Why? Yeah, we need the energy for something else. Our body's like, hey, digestion, not a high priority right now, right? Let's not take the blood to the stomach. Let's take the blood to the hands or the feet or the legs. Let's fight or run. But imagine if you have chronic anxiety. Your digestion's on, off, on, off, on, off. You're eating, and instead of your digestion getting ready to digest your food, if you're anxious, this is why it's not good to eat while you're anxious. Think about your food's like rotting in your stomach. So a lot of people have GI issues, not simply just because they have GI issues, but because there's an underlying trauma. Also, we see this a lot with respiratory diseases. What's interesting is people with trauma, kids with trauma also have higher rates of asthma because there's inflammation in their body, and that inflammation can also affect the lungs. And then another common one that we see are heart issues, cardiovascular issues. Same thing that happened during COVID. A lot of people went into the ER saying, oh, I'm dying from COVID, and it was a panic attack. Or people still today without COVID are going into the ER. I'm having a heart attack, and it's a panic attack. Because some of the symptoms are similar, but we know that it can have an underlying mental health issue. Notice here, you could be 2 times more likely to develop chronic obstructive pulmonary disease with your lungs, 4 times more likely to develop other diseases as well. How many of you here have heard of the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experiences? Okay, I would have guessed more. I'm not going to go into this in depth, but I encourage you to research it. This was a study done in 1995 by Kaiser. And it is one of like the star research studies that was done, just thousands and thousands of patients. And what they did was, Kaiser being, a hospital, looked at physical diseases. But what they were surprised to see is that they connected the adverse childhood experiences, you can think about another words to describe trauma, and how it correlated with these physical diseases. And these were some of the ACEs that they included. Not just the typical trauma, which I appreciated, but physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, both physical and emotional, but also household dysfunction. Did someone in their household have mental illness? Was mother treated violently? Was there divorce? Divorce is very, very traumatic for a child. Sometimes a child perceives that as death of a parent because they don't know what's happening. If they had someone in their family incarcerated, and then someone in their family suffering from substance abuse. So they took a look at these adverse childhood experiences, and they saw that it predicted these different diseases, physical diseases. So this was one of the first more known studies to show the link between trauma and physical disease. So you notice there that as the number, top right corner, as the number of ACEs increases, so does the risk of negative health outcomes. So typically, 4+ ACEs start to predict significantly certain physical diseases. You can look at the different outcomes. There's many different outcomes, but you see there in the bottom right corner, different physical and mental health outcomes, including stroke, cancer, lung disease, broken bones, and so forth, including obesity. This is a good example. I think this is part of the study, if not from just anecdotal research, but there was this woman who they had interviewed who was struggling with severe obesity. And in her history, she would lose the weight, gain the weight, lose the weight, gain the weight. And many of them were just treating her and helping her with just the typical behavior modification, diet, exercise, medication, so forth. And it wasn't until they uncovered the root of her obesity. She was sexually molested and abused chronically in her childhood. And she learned, if I make myself ugly, if I put on all this weight, I'm going to protect myself. No one's going to want to touch me anymore. And so that was the root. And until she healed her trauma, she wouldn't have experienced the ability to really overcome her obesity. Right? So the link between our traumas and our physical health. This is a quote that was written many years ago, but it's interesting. It highlights this connection between our mind and our body. Sickness of the mind prevails everywhere. 9/10 of the diseases from which men suffer have their foundation here, the mind. Right? This understanding that the majority of our physical illnesses are actually rooted in our bodies. And I don't think, I do have the quote later in a moment. But this is a story of a client that I saw many years ago. We'll call her Linda. And she was one of the case studies that I realized the connection. Like, I knew about it, but then I saw really lived out in her own experience between trauma and physical illness. So Linda came in to the clinic, and she was referred because she had seizures. And she had been treated for many years for epilepsy. And finally, they were able to do a newer brain scan to look at these seizures. And they found, the pattern of which her brain is firing actually doesn't demonstrate epilepsy, which is kind of scary, right? For years, you're being treated with medication for a disease, and then you find out, you actually don't have that. So they're like, where do these seizures come from? And the neurologist was very open with her, and he's like, I have no idea. And then, so he's like, maybe it's psychological. So he sends her to a mental health clinic, And she's there thinking I'm a psychiatrist, that I'll give her medication. And I'm like, actually, psychologist is different than psychiatrist, but tell me your story. Let me see if I can help. She wasn't there for therapy. She was there for medication. So she starts sharing her story, and I often walk them through a timeline to get a sense of when did the disease start? Was there anything leading up to that experience? And she shared a very important detail. So she kind of shared it in fragments, but basically the story is she was constantly raped in childhood by her brother. Just years of just chronic trauma. And finally she's like, I'm out of here. She left home. She went to college, and she told me, she's like, I forgot all about it. I reinvented myself, and I was good. I was fine. Fine. She gets married. She has a son, and she said, I'm living a good life. And then she said, out of nowhere, the seizures started. But before she shared about the seizures, she said that her first child was a boy, her second was a girl. And about this time is when her seizures started. And she then shared, she said, then it was kind of like a minor detail. She said, my daughter shared later on in life that I used to come to her bedroom drunk and say, I will never let anyone hurt you. Every single night, she'd come to her room, I will never let anyone hurt you. And so here she thought she was fine, but she was masking it with addiction, and her body was like, I'm not fine. It was when she had her daughter that all of her trauma resurfaced, right? And still there, but surfaced in a way where you may have heard of this book before, The Body Keeps the Score. It's this idea that with trauma, when we don't heal, the body holds on to it. And I like to think about it this way, is if we don't actually heal, our body starts screaming at us, saying, hello, there are signals. Sometimes those signals are panic attacks, where it's building, 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 and then our body has to explode. Or it's different ailments, but for her, there was a strong possibility that it was the trauma. And now I told her, I said, I can't guarantee it, but it's a little suspicious that the timeline of these things, right, your seizures started right after the birth of your daughter and your addictions and other things. And so I said, I can't promise, but I think therapy will help. And the therapy that I gave her was cognitive processing therapy, which I'll talk about tomorrow. And what we did is we went through the trauma. I'll talk about the steps tomorrow. And when we went through the full protocol, she already was getting better, but she hadn't had any seizures for 1 year. Now, you say, well, what happened after the year? She had a seizure. You're like, well, was it really the trauma therapy? Or was it something else? Well, the time she had the seizure was her sister was coming to visit, and her sister never knew of the trauma. And she was so afraid maybe the sister knows. And there was this re-ignition of like, I'm going to have to reveal my trauma to her. Because her brother, who was the perpetrator, was passing away at that time, and there were other things that were happening. So we had to do a second round of therapy. So we can't ever say with certainty because the mind and the body are so connected, but it's very, very, very possible that it was the trauma. This is from the book, The Body Keeps the Score. We have learned that trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It is also the imprint left by that experience on the mind, brain, and body. This imprint has ongoing consequences for how the human organism manages to survive in the present. Another great book that talks about this idea is When the Body Says No. And this one's really fascinating. It looks at other illnesses that basically doctors start realizing, there's certain patients that struggle with certain illnesses that are very nice. Like, there's just a correlation that they're very nice, and they struggle to say no, and so eventually the body starts to say no for them. Like people pleasers, right? Where they're like, can you come over and do this for me? And you want to say no, but you say yes. And the theory behind this is all of a sudden you get sick. Well, your body will start saying no for you, especially chronically if you can't say no for yourself. Very fascinating. So this is the idea highlighted in the book. Disease doesn't simply come from external threats. We think about it that way, pathogens, toxins. It arises in a body already made vulnerable. And how's it made vulnerable? Through chronic stress, emotional repression, unhealed trauma, and the body's inability to repair itself or regulate cell growth properly. That makes complete sense. Trauma, if it's a wear and tear in your body, it's going to completely wear and tear it in a way that makes it so vulnerable to pathogens, toxins, and so forth. So it's not the pathogens themselves or toxins alone. How resilient is your body if it's experienced trauma, and specifically unhealed trauma? Then we also see a social impact. This one's obvious, right? Poor social development. We see overall higher rates of divorce with people who have experienced trauma, intimate partner violence, fewer healthy relationships, and generally more unhealthy or toxic relationships. Tomorrow I'll talk about the importance of boundaries. That's something that a lot of people who have experienced trauma don't learn. But a good way to summarize this would be understanding the role of attachment. Is when we experience trauma, we don't learn how to attach in a healthy way with people. This is a book I highly recommend. It talks about attachment. It's written for couples, but it's so popular that single people read it, and it's a great preparation for singleness, for marriage when you're single as well. And it tells you what your attachment style is. So just to kind of give you an example of this, and I'm trying to think, do I talk more about this tomorrow? I don't think so. I have different presentations that elaborate on different points, but here's an example. They did an experiment with children, babies, well, young toddlers, and their mothers. And they try to see, okay, when the mother leaves, how does the child react? But then also, when the mother comes back, how does the child react? So a healthy child, how do you think the child reacts when a mother leaves, a healthy child? Cries. Some people, especially Americans, sometimes in like independent, self-reliant, are like, oh, the baby was fine. I don't need anybody. It's like, no, healthy attachment is the baby cries. But when the mom comes back, how does the baby respond? Excitement. Primarily soothed, right? Soothed. The baby is soothed. So cries, but then mom comes back soothed. But for other babies, the avoidant attachment, the mom leaves and either doesn't cry, but has this overall attitude, I don't care. The mom comes back, still plays, I don't care. What's really interesting, though, is they measured the internal stress response of the baby, and it's firing with adrenaline, cortisol, they're sweating, their heart rate is up, but on the outside, they look completely fine. That baby, in childhood, had trauma that learned, I can't rely whether or not my mom's going to be here. So let me adapt and let me seem okay, but they're not. So then they grow up. This is why it's important to know your attachment styles. They grow up to be avoidant. I'm fine. I don't need anybody. So if anyone starts to resonate with that. And adults still have that attachment style today, unless you take steps to heal. But the other one was the anxious attachment, where the mom would leave and they would cry, but how do you think the baby responded when the mom came back? They were not soothed. They were still crying, because this attachment style is also mom not being reliable, but maybe mom was sometimes there and not. The other avoidant is mom's not there at all. But this anxious child is mom going to leave again? Maybe, and this clinginess of the child, and then there's also a mix. Some people are avoidant anxious, we call that ambivalent, where they do the push and the pull. The avoidant part, but then also the anxious. So this book goes through those attachment styles, but this quote specifically highlights that babies and children who experience strong, secure attachments will grow up with a well-developed capacity to give and receive love. But babies and children who have hurtful experiences, trauma, will grow up with an impaired love or attachment style. Most of us carry wounds from our childhood that now shape how we love our spouse, kids and others around us. And many times we just go to therapy or just try to read books to say, hey, I need to work on communication. I need to work on conflict resolution. And those are important skills. But what about the underlying attachment? Were you going to say something?
I was going to say, is this the same for breastfed babies?
What do you mean? What's the same for breastfed?
Because I breastfed my kids.
Mm-hmm.
My sister did with hers.
Mm-hmm.
And, we had that push-pull. But her children is just,
So that's one variable of many, but breastfeeding does help with attachment, right? And not just, literal attachment, but even with the hormones, oxytocin, the love attachment hormone in our bodies that the women release and the children also release when they bond. So that's a variable, but it's not the only one, right? So some women can still, formula feed and others and be intentional to attach their baby. They could have the bottle but still hold the baby with them. And so now if someone says, oh, I'm not breastfeeding because they're an avoidant mother already, then yes, that would be the case. Yeah. And this is where we see this idea with trauma, hurt people hurt people. And so many times, including in church settings at times, we are really upset at people. Oh, they hurt me. But this should help build some compassion. What hurt are they carrying? What invisible wounds do they have? And notice even for myself, and I would imagine for you guys as well, I have hurt people when I've been hurt. And so instead of just being reactive to being hurt and feeling like the victim, can I understand there are people that are carrying invisible wounds that I have no clue about? I love this quote specifically. If you don't heal what hurts you, you'll bleed on people who didn't cut you. And I think a lot of us are just bleeding on each other without realizing, well, for one, that person isn't really the person who cut you. I'm carrying wounds from my mom, from my dad, from past childhood things or even adulthood things, and we need to heal those invisible wounds. And so lastly, the spiritual impact is, remember, biopsychosocial spiritual, this is a big portion of the presentation, is trauma always impacts our spirituality. And I have a lot of clients who are like, I want nothing to do with God. And I tell them, what you choose is up to you. But as a trauma therapist, I have to address the area of God because it is inevitable for all humans when they're searching for meaning, searching for purpose, to ask themselves, who is God? Who am I? Right? These big, existential questions. That's why when I worked in palliative care with terminal illness, with patients with terminal illness, even if someone was atheist, the most common question, why God, when they started to suffer? Why me? Why? Because it's inherent to us. I used to be like, oh, I'll tiptoe around the God thing. And then I'm like, no, it's a part of every single human experience. And so if any of you here are like, I don't know about this God thing, I'd encourage you to examine your trauma. Because, especially childhood trauma, if you experience any trauma from a father figure, it's the most common way in which we project onto God as a heavenly Father. And so what I love to do is to help someone uncover that and say, hey, is that really God, or is it the person who hurt you, that you're understanding God through that lens? And maybe you're a person who is a person of faith, and you're trying to witness to someone else. It's important to not just be like, hey, this is God. It's like, well, who's the God that they know? And I had once told one client, and it was a bold move, and he initially got upset at me, and then afterwards he's like, okay, I understand. I was like, I don't believe the God you believe. And he's like, because it was filtered through his childhood in a way that he thought God was vindictive, God was unforgiving, that God was a God to punish. And even to this day, at times he's like, oh, I got this physical health problem, God is punishing me, right? So re-examining those these perceptions that we have of God through our understanding of trauma. So the wounds are many. Notice biopsychosocial, spiritual, but we have to realize many times they're invisible. And we're so busy these days that we're not taking the time to actually reflect with it. And then the last point of why we should talk, well, actually, part of the last point of talking about trauma is we're so confused about it. We don't want to talk about it because we're confused. Partially, we're confused because there's a lot of paradoxes of trauma. And I'm just going to highlight a few for the sake of time. Is some people are like, I experienced trauma and I want to bury it. But yet, the paradox is it's hard to banish from consciousness. Another common one is number 6, where we desperately seek connection, wanting to cling to others, but also we have this strong urge to isolate, withdraw, push others away. And so often we're confused. If you've been in a relationship, a friendship, romantic, whatever it may be, with someone who's experienced trauma, you're often confused. I'm like, there are mixed signals. They're like, want to be close to me, but then they pull away, like that child, where mom comes back and the child's like, I want to attach, but then I don't. I'm scared. Trauma, and when we experience trauma, is very confusing, both for us in relationships, but especially for the person who's internally struggling. They have these big emotions, and yet they're trying to hide the emotions. They're trying, like number 5, explosively angry and harmful to their family, but they can't even stand the thought of others being harmed. It's very confusing both for the person and for the loved ones. But probably one of the reasons why it's so confusing is because of the why question. These are the things that we commonly ask. Why me? Why God? Why trauma? Why pain and suffering? Why do bad things happen? And we have really bad responses to these why questions. So we're going to do a quick exercise of just in your head, don't say it out loud. What would you say to someone, and I'm going to give different scenarios, what would you say if Mary comes up to you and she tells you that she was recently raped? Again, in the framework of she's asking, why me? Or why did God let this happen? Or, I'm a good person, why is this happening? What would you say? Do you have a good response to these why questions? But let's say Mary doesn't only share that she was recently raped, but she says she's been raped multiple times. Would your response change at all? What about Robert and Susie, a young couple who just had a miscarriage? And they're wrestling. Why? Why did it happen? But then they share that they've been doing heavy drugs during the pregnancy. Would your answer change of why? What this exercise is highlighting is that you probably had the urge, especially with the new information about Mary or about this couple, to be like, oh, you were raped multiple times? What did you do to put yourself in the position to be raped? We wouldn't say that maybe out loud, but we would start thinking it. Or for this couple, we would start thinking, oh, well, it was because of the drugs. And that's because we have what we call the just world hypothesis, where we think the world is just, orderly, and predictable. And so when bad things happen, we start looking for a reason. Oh, you were raped because you were wearing a short skirt, right? It's your fault. We start blaming the victim. These are things we say that reinforces this hypothesis. You get what you deserve. What goes around comes around. Everything happens for a reason. You reap what you sow. You got what was coming to you. God is punishing me. This is so unfair, because we think, again, the world is fair. So if I get cancer, it's unfair. Why me? But if you think about it, the world is not fair. The world is not just. Sometimes someone was wearing a long skirt and they got hurt, right? Or maybe someone had a miscarriage and they weren't doing drugs. So we're always looking for A causing B, but what we do with this is we often blame the victim. This is highlighted in the book When Bad Things Happen to Good People, written by a Jewish rabbi who says, I used to think like, all these bad things were happening to bad people. But then it happened to me. My son was diagnosed with progeria, which is rapid aging, basically waiting for the son to die at an early age. And he started realizing, whoa. And he says here, it's not how the world's supposed to work. Tragedies like this happen to selfish or dishonest people, bad people. And so it disrupted his view of the world. Because the world is nice if we think it's just, if it's orderly, if it's predictable. So we don't talk about trauma because we don't want the comfort that this hypothesis gives us to be ripped away. Trauma rips the certainty of life that anything could happen, even to good people. Another common book on trauma, more so for clinicians, but she says, to study psychological trauma is to come face to face both with human vulnerability, which is scary, in the natural world, and with the capacity for evil in human nature. We don't want to talk about it. It makes us feel really uncomfortable. You've probably felt this when watching, a movie about trauma or human trafficking, and it's just like, we want to cover our eyes and live in ignorant bliss. And so that's why when trauma happens to other people, we try to find a reason that fits our clean little orderly world. But what often that does is it creates a lot of shame. And this is what keeps trauma going. Perpetrators silence the victim by telling them it was your fault. You did something wrong. Going back to my story about Linda, one of the reasons why Linda carried the trauma for so long is that she had another sibling that she did tell, and that sister told her, oh, he tried that with me, but I pushed him off, so you must have wanted it. And so she carried this blame, it's my fault, for the rest of her life. So that silences the victim. Oh, if it's my fault, if I'm actually the perpetrator in some ways, I'm not going to share that with anyone. Others silence the victim, and sadly, this can also happen in church settings in the way we blame the victim, and then we silence ourselves. Ultimately, the enemy is silencing us. Blaming the victim is a way of reassuring ourselves that the world isn't as bad of a place as it may seem, and that there are good reasons for people suffering. It makes everyone feel better, except the victim, who now suffers the double abuse of social condemnation on top of his original misfortune. And so, why do we talk about trauma? In this context, we need to explore and discover that there are answers to the why questions of trauma. And one of the greatest stories, which we don't have time to get into, but it's the story of Job. Job, it starts off very clearly. He is a blameless person. It says it multiple times because in case you wanted to blame Job, which his friends did, to be just world hypothesis, Job, you must have done something wrong. But it's very clear. This is why they believe that Job was the very first book written in the Bible. I think that God was like, hey, people are going to struggle with suffering. Let me make sure that they have an understanding that it's not their fault. Job was the victim, blameless. And so we struggle, okay, well, why did God allow it to happen? And we know that there are answers for the why me, the why God, why suffering in that story. And I encourage you to study that story. And so, in a presentation full with a lot of negative statistics and talking about a lot about trauma, is there hope? Is there healing? And that's what part 2 and 3 will be about. But we know that there is an enemy who has caused the trauma. And part of John 10:10 actually says that there's a thief who's come to steal, kill, and destroy, including through trauma. I mean, think about it. If you had one strategy to really harm humans, and trauma impacts your biology, your social relationships, your spirituality, right, your psychological health, every part of your being, it's a good strategy to attack the mind. But Jesus says, yeah, there is a thief. There's someone out there. There's trauma out there, right? Don't think it a strange thing when these things happen to you. It's a part of life. We can't cover our eyes. But he says, I've come that they may have life and that they may have it more abundantly. So the question then comes from this presentation is, how do I have that healing, right? If it's invisible, one, I need to be able to recognize that. And hopefully this presentation has maybe, allowed for more reflection. But then also, how do I pursue? What steps can I take for that abundant healing? I'll always end our presentations with some questions to reflect on. What are my past trauma or traumas? Where on the spectrum am I? How have my traumas impacted my life, biologically, psychologically, socially, spiritually, etc.? Have I struggled with the whys of trauma? Have I often blamed God for that? Have I silenced myself or others in trauma? And so we will talk about specific steps, but before we do, we're going to talk about in this next presentation, after we take a quick break, the restriction of addiction. Because many of us, before we try to heal, we need to remove something that's blocking the healing, which is addiction. So it's 4:15. At least maybe like a 10-minute break. People can stretch their legs, and I don't know if you're going to say something, but go for it.